Now, we had been talking about the changes going on at the local level. We had been talking about the changes that the progressives were pushing at the city and town level, and we discussed the fact that as these changes were taking place, as they were taking root in American society, the idea was that those local changes would eventually cause changes at the state level. Those changes at the state level would eventually cause changes at the national level. And while there were some cities that had adopted these new policies, the commission system or the city manager system, things like that, it wasn't really going to be seen wildly across the United States. There was movement toward what the progressives had desired, but it wasn't going as quickly as some would like. So we're going to move from talking about what was happening at the local level, and we're going to move it up a notch. We're going to talk about what was happening at this point in time at the state level. Now, keep in mind, at the state level, your most obvious target of opportunity, for lack of a better term, is going to be your governor. The governor is going to be probably the most known individual within the state political system. A governor does have the authority to go through and pass the regulations and laws within their state as long as they don't violate the national law. We have in the Constitution something called the Supremacy Clause, and the Supremacy Clause essentially says that no law in any state can actually supersede the Constitution, the treaties of the United States government, or the laws of the U.S. government. So we have under this system, it's called federalism, that the states can do pretty much what they want as long as it doesn't violate national law. And you're going to find that as we moved into the 20th century, that there were a number of different governors that were of a progressive mindset that wanted to bring about changes to their states. Now, some of these progressive governors were going to be very forthright and very aggressive in what they were doing in regards to change. Others were going to be a little more reticent. They were going to kind of hold back a little bit and not be as aggressive. But generally speaking, it's going to be these different progressive governors are going to have an impact on not just the America of that point in time, but we are still dealing with some of the repercussions of the progressive movement to this very day. It all really comes down to how each governor is going to rule their particular state. Now, as I said, when it comes to the state level, the governors can pretty much go through and really have a lot of say as to how their state is going to be run. And so we're going to talk a little bit right now about what would be referred to as reform governors. Those governors of the various states who are going through and they want to change things. They are part of this progressive movement and they want to make these changes within their state. But not just for their state. They want their state to come across as an example to others. They want people to see how well the reforms are working in their state to make others want the same thing to happen in their state. Okay? So these reform governors are going to go through and they're going to pass a number of different laws and regulations. They're going to regulate things like railroads. Now, we talked about this previously with Munn versus Illinois, that railroads are considered a public good or a public service or utility. And as such, if they're only going to be within the state itself, what's known as intrastate commerce, then a governor really does have a great deal of authority as to what's going to happen. If they cross a state line, however, then that becomes Congress's responsibility because that's interstate commerce. So you're going to see laws passed to regulate railroads. You're going to see laws passed to regulate mining, the actual, getting resources out of the ground, plus things like telephone companies, electric companies, gas companies. They're all going to be things which are, yes, they are definitely private enterprise. They are private companies, but at the same time, they are also a public utility. And as a result, these reform governors were of the opinion that, yes, it was definitely okay for the state to go through and regulate them. Now, we still see some of this today with things like, for example, PG&E or the telephone companies. So you do have this ongoing, consequence, for lack of a better word, of the reforms that were made at this time. And I said previously that some of the governors are going to be very aggressive in their changes. Some governors are going to be a little more, hesitant. One of the more aggressive ones was this guy. His name is Robert M. La Follette. Now, I've also heard it pronounced La Follette. I do not know which is the correct one, so we'll just go with La Follette. Now, this is Robert Fighting Bob La Follette was what he was known as. He was the governor of Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, still to this very day, is considered one of the more progressive states in the United States. He came into the governorship with the idea of different changes that needed to come about within his state. Now, yes, he wanted to make Wisconsin the goal of other states. He wanted other states, as I said before, to see how well these reforms were working and want to copy them. But first and foremost, his concern was with the people of the state of Wisconsin. It wasn't about trying to change things nationally, though he would not have been opposed to that, but it was more about what was going to happen to his own state. And he led the way in regulating various businesses. He is one of the governors who feels that a great number of corporations and companies and things like that had way too much power and way too much influence over, the state government or the national government, and as such wanted to go through and wanted to change what was happening in regards to that relationship. He did not want the various corporations, like railroads, for example, to have that much influence over the people who are making the laws within his state. So he's going to really kind of push the envelope in regulating business. One of the things he did was he taxed railroad property at the same rate as other business property. Now keep in mind, railroads at this point in time were the predominant way that people and cargo were transported all over the nation. And as such, if you could have a railroad hub in your state, that meant more income for your state. So a number of states would cut deals with the railroads. They would set up various tax laws that would make things a little easier or make it more, cost effective for the railroad to actually be there. But he decided that they were going to make sure that all businesses were going to be paying the same. It did not matter if you were a railroad or a grocery store. You were going to pay the same taxes as everybody else. He even went so far as to set up a commission within his state to look at the rates that the railroads were charging. Again, not just for passengers, but also for freight. This could be beneficial. It could also be a problem. Because you keep in mind, railroads are interstate corporations, especially if you're going to be crossing any kind of state line, then you're going to be stepping on Congress's toes. As I said previously, if it's only within the state itself, if it's intrastate commerce, yes, you would have a lot more authority to look at the rates and regulate those rates. But if it's interstate commerce, if it was a train coming into Wisconsin or going from Wisconsin to another state, well, then that's going to be Congress, and you're going to have some difficulties at times with that. Some of these different regulations and things like that would be struck down by the Supreme Court. Others would be upheld. It just sort of depended. Another thing that he did in regards to railroads was he forbade the use of free passes to state officials. Now, this was not a bribe, technically. It wasn't that the railroad companies were giving any of the state officials cash, but they were giving them free passes to use the trains. And trains were the predominant form of transport. This would be almost the equivalent of saying, hey, I know you're a state senator and I can't bribe you, but you can use my private jet whenever you want. Okay, it's that kind of thing. And Governor LaFollette really wanted to reduce the impact, wanted to reduce the influence and the control that the railroads had over the legislators in his state. So he forbade the use of this. Now, again, like I said, this was not a direct tax or a direct bribe of any kind, but it was used to, curry influence. It meant that perhaps, and even if it was just the appearance, it meant that it looked as if the railroads were buying these various state legislators, that they were going through and they would be controlled and that they would vote however the railroads wanted them to vote. Again, LaFollette was really more concerned with what was going on in Wisconsin, but he also wanted his state to be a shining example to everybody else in the nation as to what the progressive policies he was putting forward could actually do and the way they could actually benefit everyone. Whether or not the changes that he made and the consequences we're still dealing with, are those good, bad, or ugly? Again, I leave that 100% up to you. You can do all the research you want and you can make your own conclusion. All I can do is tell you what actually transpired and not tell you what to think about it. Now, we had mentioned before, one of the goals of progressivism was to go through and really make things better for those who seem to be in the worst off position. And one of the groups that we talked about was children, okay? In particular, we talked about the fact that at this point in time, as the 19th century became the 20th century, there were a lot of children who were part of the workforce at this point in time. And so, at a state level, protecting working children became very important as well. Now, remember, any business is in business basically to make money, okay? It doesn't matter if you're a grocery store or a train corporation. You're there because you're trying to make money. And one of the biggest areas in which any corporation or any company is going to have to spend a great deal of money is going to be in paying their employees. And so if you can hire people for a cheaper amount of money, a lot of businesses will hire whoever the cheapest worker is because it's going to save them money in the long run. This is one of the reasons that children were hired at this point in time. They were hired because they could be paid a great deal less than an adult. The argument being that, they're little kids, they can't do as much work. So kids would be hired because they could be paid less. They were also hired on account of the machinery and whatnot. They could get in and around it. They could move in the machinery sometimes and actually, do things that a full-grown adult would be unable to accomplish. So kids were being hired because they were cheaper and they could do, some different little tasks. The thing is, this was a point in time where we've said before, there was no social safety net. There was no unemployment or workers' comp or anything along those lines. All you really had at that point was whatever job was available to you. And as a result, oftentimes every member of a family had to work. It didn't matter if you were the mom, dad, kid, any of the above. Oftentimes everybody had to pull together to try and come up with sufficient money to make sure that they were able to pay the rent, they were able to keep a roof over their head, that they were able to go through and provide enough so there would be food on the table. And oftentimes, this took the entire family. Okay, wages were much different back then. Yes, things were cheaper, but wages were phenomenally different. So, as a result, oftentimes these kids were not working because they thought it was a good idea or not working because they wanted to. They were working because the family required it just to stay afloat. So you have children working in a variety of jobs, some of them dangerous, some of them, not so dangerous, but, mind numbing. I've mentioned before, kids would be the ones to reset the pins at bowling alleys, for example. But it was because everybody in the family had to chip in. So you've got to understand, there was no federal law in regards to child labor. Okay? The national government, Washington, D.C., had no law on the books restricting kids from actually working. It wasn't like there was a minimum age at which you had to attain before you could go to work or anything like that. No, it was basically a free-for-all that anybody could go through and they could hire pretty much anyone for whatever job. Since there was no national law, and I mentioned before federalism is the concept that a state can do pretty much whatever it wants as long as it doesn't violate national law. Now the states were going to start to ban child labor. And again, we have 50 laboratories of democracy today. Each state is different from each other. It is a safe bet to assume that California is going to be different from Alabama, which is going to be different from Maine, which is going to be different from Hawaii. And so states began to ban this on their own. Now, granted, this was not nationwide. It wasn't that every state started to do this, but different governors and different state legislatures started to work on the process of making sure that child labor was no longer going to be allowed within their state. Now, there was also at this time efforts to limit the number of hours people were required to work. Now, today we think about an 8-hour workday, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week. We think about that as just common, and that anything beyond that 40 hours would be overtime. Well, that wasn't the case back then. It used to be that you worked as many hours as you had to work or as many hours as you were told to work. There was no such thing as overtime. But there were some attempts to limit different working hours, for example. There was a case called Mueller v. Oregon. Okay, in this case, you had women were mandated to work fewer hours than men. And they sued, there were a group of women sued over this, saying that that was a violation of their right to basically enter into a contract they wanted. The women wanted to be able to work as many hours as they wanted to and not be limited. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, however, rules that the Oregon law saying that women could not work as many hours as men was constitutional, that it was acceptable. So, in all actuality, what you're seeing is that the federal government, even though there are some various state laws going through trying to change the working hours and stuff like that, the federal government, through the Supreme Court, is still upholding, the former ideas. It was in 1917, for example, that the Supreme Court finally upheld a maximum of a 10-hour workday for men, that anything beyond that was considered unreasonable. Now, again, we look at it today through the lens of being used to the 8-hour workday. And so you can think about what a dramatic change this was. Instead of it being just you worked from, the old saying was from could to couldn't. You worked from when you could see to when you couldn't see. Now there's going to be a maximum amount of time. You're starting to see changes coming on a nationwide basis. Since this is something that has gone before the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court rules, it's going to be the same for every single state, not just for the one state. This is going to set a precedent, and for the first time, you're going to see a nationwide limitation on the number of hours you could require somebody to actually work. Now, there is one last little area of reform at the state level we're going to talk about, and that is something, as I'm recording this, it is October of 2020, and we are just about 2 weeks away from a presidential election. And so it is quite appropriate that the last thing we talk about on this one is reforming actual elections. Now, some of the reforms that are going through today, we so take for granted that it's hard to imagine they were ever controversial or thought-provoking or anything along those lines. But at the time, it was a major shift. Nowadays, it's just what we anticipate each day. Much like that 8-hour workday is now just assumed, this stuff is assumed now, but wasn't at the turn of the century. For example, go back to Oregon again. Oregon became the first state in the Union to officially adopt the secret ballot, giving voters privacy. Today, if you go and vote, you're given your ballot, you go to a little spot where nobody can see what you're writing, you mark your choices, it goes into a box and is counted after that. No one knows who you voted for. They can't connect you to that particular ballot or anything like that. The idea of the secret ballot is so ingrained in us today that we don't think twice about it. But back then, this was something shocking and new. It had never really been officially adopted like that before. And so now you're going to see it as policy from that point forward. Another thing that is very near and dear to the hearts of Californians is the initiative. It's the idea that voters themselves can put a law up for a vote, that you can go through and you can get enough signatures throughout the state of California, for example, that becomes an initiative. It goes on the ballot and then everybody votes on it. If it is approved, then you have just created a law for the state. Traditionally, it had always been that laws came exclusively from the legislative branch, that they would debate it, pass a law, send it to the governor, for example, sign it, and it would become a law. Now you had the ability, much closer to the people, that if there was an issue that got people worked up, they could be the ones to go out and actually, change the law itself. A referendum. Voters could accept or reject an initiative by a direct vote. It wasn't just that they could propose a law. Now they had the right guaranteed that they were the ones to approve or reject it. And every year you see a lot of this in California. There will be various propositions, and more than one will be put together because somebody got a sufficient number of signatures. And as a result, now the people have direct access to making and approving the laws. Now, this isn't the case for everywhere in the country, but it is, again, something in California that we have just come to see as, normal, everyday part of life. Another thing that came about at this time was the ability of a recall election, where you could force government officials to face another election. Now, California did this 20-30 years ago. We had a governor in office by the name of Gray Davis. He faced a recall election. He was removed from office, and then they replaced him with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So recall elections are pretty rare, but they do occur. And when they do occur, it can have huge titanic shifts in the political spectrum of that particular state at the time. Another state at this time to talk about, Minnesota. Minnesota adopted the statewide direct primary. Okay, this meant that people would want to be the candidate. Beforehand, they were picked by the machines. They were picked by a party caucus, for example. Now it's going to be the voters of that particular party will decide who their nominee is going to be. Now, in this past year, we saw in 2019 into 2020, we saw the Democrats had a large field of people running to be their nominee, and the primary was eventually won by former Vice President Joe Biden. In this case, the primary was something new. Before that, it had always been decided by others and then, put forth as this is the candidate, take it or leave it. Now, again, the people are going to have a say in who's going to be running their government. Now, while all this is going on, these are a lot of changes within the states, that's to be sure, but what about on the national level? Well, in this case, we're going to talk about senators and what's known as the direct election of senators. Now, before this, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. Okay, the people of a state voted for their state legislature. The state legislature then decided on who the senators were going to be from that particular state. It meant that the senators could focus exclusively on what were the needs of the state as a whole rather than worry about getting reelected. Well, the 17th Amendment came along and changed that. Now the senators would be directly elected by the people. It would make them sort of an at-large representative of the entire state. Instead of them just representing one district, they would represent the people of the whole state. And again, this is one of those issues that there is positive and negative about it. It is one of those that there are those people who have a very strong feeling about this. But it is something that we have come to accept. The 17th Amendment went through and changed politics. It changed the way the Senate was put together. Now, this has been going on for a century now, so we don't think much about it. But at the time, it was radical. You think about it. It was an amendment to the Constitution. Grand total in the history of our nation, we've only changed the Constitution 27 times. 10 of those were put in there by the Founding Fathers. So it really is a big change. Love it or hate it, it is the law of the land now, and it is the way that we elect our senators. All of these changes were coming about because of the progressive desire to reform what was happening in politics, in particular at the state level. And we haven't even begun to discuss what was going to happen at the national level.